I believe in which
certainly in the United States,
will create
the
ways by which we live.
In today's interview, we're joined by Mark Thomson, Executive Director of Carbon Transition Pathways. Mark is focused on helping companies in hard-to-abate sectors find practical decarbonization solutions that can be implemented to deliver real emissions reductions and plan a credible path to a low emissions future. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Hannes. It's good to be here.
For the beginning, tell me, who is Mark Thomson?
Good question. Well, my background is actually chemicals and oil and gas. So I'm an engineer by qualification. Started out in mechanical engineering and maintenance, working in ammonia and hydrogen manufacturing, and then worked my way through downstream oil and gas, and then upstream oil and gas, and then eventually consulting before ending up where I am now, trying to accelerate the energy transition with my company, Carbon Transition Pathways, which I co-founded with three like-minded individuals back in 2020.
Tell me, how do you assess the current pace of the energy transition, and what steps do you believe need to be taken to accelerate it?
Well, I think in reality, the energy transition is only just starting. So I think to many people, it appears to be quite slow. But we are, I think, at the beginning of a number of overlapping technology disruptions with reinforcing feedback loops that are going to drive exponential rates of change over the next couple of decades. So, for example, you have reducing costs, driving uptake of a technology, which then drive cost reductions, and that's a reinforcing feedback loop. And the opposite is true of outgoing technologies. Also, socially, you have new technologies which are gaining increasingly popularity exponentially, while the opposite is true for the incumbent technology. So, I think it's going to accelerate away, and that's going to happen fairly soon. I think we'll start to see that very quickly. In fact, we're already starting to see it with the uptake of solar PV. Regarding how to accelerate it, I think governments need to take the lead in that role and use the levers of legislation, taxation, and regulation to help provide a tailwind and drive it along faster.
What role do you see for hydrogen in the future energy mix, and what challenges must be overcome to increase its share?
Yeah, hydrogen's a tricky one. In terms of like the energy mix, I think hydrogen has a pretty minimal role to play for the foreseeable future. As a fuel, hydrogen is a highly inefficient and inconvenient molecule, and it doesn't make a very good energy vector. But we currently use about 100 million tons a year in chemical processes, including ammonia manufacturing, fossil fuel refining, and methanol production. So decarbonizing that is an enormous challenge, I think, without us dreaming up new uses for hydrogen as an energy vector or as a fuel. In addition, another application that I think could make sense is in decarbonizing steelmaking, where hydrogen can be used to replace coal or gas as the reductant in the iron ore reducing process. But there are still some unresolved issues with that, which are preventing it becoming, I think, a universal technology. It can only be used with certain qualities of iron ore effectively.
Considering the significant investments required for the energy transition, what financing models will most efficiently mobilize capital?
Well, historically, large-scale, low-cost finance has been provided to proven technologies with a high certainty of revenue, either through firm long-term offtake agreements, or access to growth markets with, usually a significant safety buffer in the margins of the product. With the energy transition, there are technology risks, coupled with a reluctance from off-takers to be the first to sign up for a long-term off-take contract. And I think part of this is because prices for most energy technologies are anticipated to decline. So why would somebody sign up for a long-term off-take agreement now when they could sign up somewhere down the line and get it cheaper? So grant funding can't really combat this. And I think governments need to step in and underwrite some of the long-term offtakes through contracts for difference, and potentially using other incentives such as tax concessions or carbon pricing.
So pretty connected with that one. How can policy and regulation evolve to support the energy transition better?
That's a really tough question. I'm not sure anybody has the answer to that, but I think policy needs to evolve to reward risk taking, whilst also penalizing business as usual. And the challenge here is in not making profitable businesses uncompetitive, resulting in like offshoring of the business, and job losses and a decline in the local economy. Particularly when you have an industry, for instance, that's exposed to international trade. Additionally, governments need to be careful not to pick winners by favoring one technology over another when there's no clear case to do so. I think hydrogen is a prime example of this. So I think it's a really tough problem. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think that probably, looking globally, the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism is a good start.
But why do you think they are favoring hydrogen?
I can't really answer that. I'm not sure, because to me, it just doesn't make any sort of logical sense. I think there's a number of potential reasons. Hydrogen is been hyped up into a very big thing. So there's, I think, a bit of FOMO about, and no one nation wants to be left behind. So everybody has their, their hydrogen strategies and hydrogen plans. I think, there's a number of people who probably recognize that it's not going to work, but see the opportunity to set something up, suck in a bunch of investment and potentially then, bail out before people realize that the emperor has no clothes. But yeah, it's a tricky one, and I'm not sure what's exactly driving it.
So what's your prediction? How long will the hype last?
It's going to be a while, but I think we're already starting to see signs of the wheels coming off in places. There's lots of indications that investments are not happening, and the speed of investment is not happening. There's lots of companies putting projects on hold, deferring them, cancelling them. So yeah, well, I think it will continue to play out over the next few years, but I think that this is potentially the beginning of the bubble popping at the moment.
So basically, you're not giving it 10 years.
No, I think it's still got some time left in it to run. And I mean, to be honest with you, there are some, like we established some use cases for hydrogen that really make sense and that need to be decarbonized, and there's nothing we can do about it because it needs hydrogen for that specific product or process. So we've got a big task ahead to address that. 100 million tons of hydrogen needs to be replaced with green hydrogen, or maybe not 100 million, because about half of that is actually used in oil and gas processing. So, if we get things right, then hopefully most of that demand goes away eventually, but that's going to take quite a long time.
What impact do you foresee the energy transition having on global energy markets, especially in terms of pricing and supply stability?
Well, I think we can probably expect some significant volatility as the world works its way through the energy transition. At the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty around energy, which does not really favor investment, and underinvestment typically results in supply deficits, and then you get price spikes, and so then you start a cycle of potentially overinvestment and prices depressed. So I think it's going to be a bumpy ride. Additionally, the market mechanisms that we have were built around the incumbent systems, and I don't think they're entirely fit for purpose to send the right market signals as we transition to new energy sources. So that's another issue that needs ironing out. Many of the current petrostates, which are not lower down on the cost curve, I think are going to find themselves with dwindling revenues, and that's probably going to cause a degree of unrest. And additionally, I think that the notion of shipping energy around the world to supply industry is going to end up being turned on its head as energy intensive industries relocate to where the lowest cost, lowest emissions energy is available. At the moment, energy comes conveniently in molecular form out of the ground, and we process it a bit and then put it on a ship, and it's very easy to take it where you want it to go. With renewables being the source of energy, it gets a lot more difficult to transport it around because you have to convert electricity into something else, which then comes with enormous losses in transformation. Every time you transfer energy into a different form, you lose a fair amount of it. So I think, rather than shipping energy, we will move industry to connect with the energy at source. And I think, again, governments need to step up here with policies that provide stability and certainty to underpin the large-scale investments in both the new and incumbent energy technologies to try and help smooth the bumps out.
Somehow you managed to open my next questions. Regarding infrastructure, what key elements need to be developed or transformed to facilitate a broader uptake of renewable energy?
Well, I'm sure you've heard this before, but I think, transmission grids, the importance of transmission grids cannot be overstated. So if electricity is going to be the new currency of energy, then we need the means of transporting it around, and the transmission and distribution grids are the means of doing that. However, I think to complement the transmission, we need to encourage investment in storage, and the storage needs to be co-located with renewable generators, but also in demand centers where there are variable load profiles, because this will enable maximum utilization of the transmission infrastructure. Because if you think about having a renewable energy generator that's intermittent, and you have a power line that is matched to the capacity of that generator, then a lot of the time that power line is going to be underutilized. Whereas if you have a power line that is potentially below the capacity of the renewable generator, but you have storage where you're absorbing some of those renewables to then push it down the line when the renewables aren't generating, you can make much better use of the grid infrastructure. I also believe that I think vehicle to grid technology holds massive potential to unlock existing grid capacity, because we are going to end up with hundreds of gigawatt hours of distributed storage, and with that, even a fraction of that being connected to the grid, will have significant impact.
So basically, it should be cheaper to develop grid lines than pipelines. in the long term?
I think that it depends in terms of units of energy, and there's different implications around grid lines and pipelines. But I think that investing in the grid infrastructure is a no regrets move. I mean, electrification is the answer to decarbonization, and the way of moving electrons around is through the grid.
You've stated that hydrogen production and transport are expensive compared to batteries. Can you provide a cost comparison to illustrate this point?
Okay. It's a little bit tricky because the cost comparisons or relative costs are all kind of highly specific depending on the use case and what assumptions you make regarding the inputs. However, the underlying fundamentals of hydrogen vehicles just don't stack up against BEVs. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are substantially more expensive to purchase than a battery electric vehicle. So the upfront cost is more. And the gap is widening as battery costs continue to fall. So you've also got the issue that fuel cell electric vehicles are substantially more expensive to operate, and the higher operating costs come from the high cost of hydrogen at refueling stations and the higher maintenance costs associated with a significantly more complex drivetrain in an FCEV. So you get arguments from hydrogen proponents that the cost of hydrogen is going to come down, but much of the cost decline is predicated on the cost of electricity coming down, which then also makes battery electric vehicles cheaper to charge. So, as the cost of hydrogen comes down, and so the cost of refueling a BEV also comes down. Looking at specific costs globally, hydrogen prices at filling stations currently range, I think, from about $15 to $35 a kilogram. And taking the Toyota Mirai as an example, which is obviously one of the few fuel cell electric vehicles you can actually purchase, a kilogram of hydrogen would get you about 85 kilometers. If you compare that with a similar sized vehicle, a BEV, a Tesla Model 3, that would deliver an efficiency of about 14 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. So when you wrangle all those numbers around and say, what does $15 a kilogram of hydrogen work out at in terms of an equivalent electricity price to charge a Tesla, you're looking at about $1.10 per kilowatt hour, which is enormously expensive electricity and far more than you would pay anywhere. So, I think it's fairly clear that running costs for a battery electric vehicle are substantially lower. Probably another point that's worth mentioning is that green hydrogen is still virtually non-existent. So a fuel cell electric vehicle comes with emissions that are equivalent to an efficient internal combustion engine vehicle. For anybody who's interested in learning more about this, I would recommend Googling the Hydrogen Science Coalition. They have an enormous amount of material that you can research and find out, all of the numbers and pluses and minuses, and draw your own conclusions.
What are your thoughts on the commercial viability of hydrogen, and under what circumstances, if any, could it become viable?
I think as a fuel, hydrogen has some fundamental problems that I don't believe can be overcome to make it competitive with alternative solutions. As previously mentioned, we also do use a lot of it in chemical processes, and one way or another, we need to replace the existing use cases. So I think, we probably need to make those uses commercially viable by whatever mechanism, because that's something that we absolutely have to do. We can't carry on. So in that respect, I envisage probably we'll end up with a combination of cost reductions, because there will be some cost reductions, they are achievable, and carbon pricing to make the incumbent technologies more expensive. And ultimately, we may just have to accept the fact that we need to pay more for products which have hydrogen in their value chain, or find ways to use less of it. There's a lot of hydrogen goes into ammonia for fertilizers. We use fertilizers for food. Is food going to become more expensive with green hydrogen? Possibly, but then also I think a lot of fertilizer is over applied. And so there is potentially efficiencies in applications and uses of fertilizer, which might mean that, whilst it's more expensive, we can counteract that by using less of it to achieve the same outcome in terms of food production. So I think, it'll work through, and the economics will drive it in whatever direction. And we'll see what comes out.
The concept of disappearing demand in the circular economy context is fascinating. Can you discuss how this might impact global energy consumption patterns?
There's certainly potential for demand in raw materials to reduce as we reuse and recycle more of them. I think, however, overall demand for most commodities is forecast to grow for many years to come as developing nations raise their standard of living, and recycling is not going to be able to address all of this growth, although I suspect it will slow down the growth in sort of raw materials, in virgin raw materials. However, obviously energy is still required for recycling, and it isn't always less energy intensive or lower cost to recover raw materials from waste than it is to find and develop new resources. Having said that, the energy balance and economics of recycling some of the most useful and also energy intensive materials, such as copper, aluminium and steel, are very favorable. And I envisage that we will be doing a lot more recycling of those materials in the future. So I think in the long run, I would expect our economies will be less resource and less energy intensive, but it's going to take a little while for that to play out.
So since you're already giving predictions, given the massive scale of the global oil and gas market, what realistic timeline do you envision for a meaningful shift towards alternative energy sources?
Oh, I think that's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, isn't it? It's I don't know if there's any right answer to that. I guess for context, historically, energy transitions have taken about 100 years and have never actually really been complete. But the transition is defined as complete by the point at which the incoming energy source represented more than 50% of the total energy consumption. So, if you look historically, we actually burn more biomass today than we did before coal was discovered, in spite of the fact that we transitioned away from biomass to coal. And we burn more coal today than we did before oil and gas were discovered. So in reality, our thirst for energy has meant we've never really transitioned so much as added new sources of energy on top of old. But that obviously is not an option if we want to fully decarbonize our energy system, which is also, I think, an order of magnitude larger than it was at the start of the last transition. So you can't really overstate the magnitude of the task ahead. Fortunately, we have a couple of things that are going in our favor. I previously alluded to the technology disruptions and reinforcing feedback loops that are going to drive exponential growth curves. So I think that could take people by surprise at how quickly that happens. And also somewhere between 60 and 70% of the fossil fuel energy that we consume in terms of primary energy ends up as waste heat. So with electrification, a lot of this issue goes away, and therefore I say we only, and that's a very, very big only, need to replace about a third of our current primary energy consumption. As to how long do I think it will take, I suspect it's going to happen faster than many incumbents anticipate, but probably not as fast as we need it to head off some of the more severe impacts of global average temperature rises.
Back to hydrogen. With the global hydrogen production being predominantly non-green, what steps do you see as necessary to increase the proportion of green hydrogen?
Well, I mean, we definitely need to incentivize green hydrogen. As we've previously discussed, there's a lot of hydrogen we need to decarbonize. But the problem that we have, I think, is with unilateral subsidies for green hydrogen, you could get the result where it's temporarily commercially competitive in use cases as a fuel, where there are probably better alternative technologies, but which are not subsidized. And this is the kind of picking winners issue. So eventually, when you remove the subsidies, the better technology comes to the fore, and it leaves the hydrogen infrastructure as a stranded asset. One of the other issues I can see with this is that due to the very low efficiency of hydrogen as a fuel, we would end up consuming large quantities of renewable electricity, which could be used to much greater effect with respect to emissions reduction if it was put to alternative uses. So I think in an ideal world, any hydrogen incentive should be scaled based on the life cycle emissions reduction that it achieves by the specific use case that it's actually being put into. And even that may not be enough. So you might actually need to level the playing field and subsidize, competing technologies for that specific use case as well. But I think trying to actually implement that would be a bit of an administrative nightmare. So I'm not sure what the practical solution is. The alternative, of course, is just pricing emissions, which is completely technology agnostic, but also seemingly political suicide. So, that also is quite tricky. I think Canada has a really good system. So they have a steadily escalating carbon price where most of the proceeds are returned equally to all taxpayers. And this has the impact of incentivizing emissions reduction, penalizing those with above average emissions footprints, and rewarding those with below average emissions, and doesn't favor any specific technology.
Talking about investments and incentives, some of the World Bank's rules provide a framework for scaling hydrogen production. How do you assess the realism of these numbers, and where do you think they fall short?
So I assume here you're referring to the 1, 10, 20, 30 rule, which
exactly
basically states that 1 million tons of green hydrogen production annually requires 10 gigawatts of electrolyzers powered by 20 gigawatts of renewable power generation and costs about $30 billion. So if we just look into that a little bit, so for 10 gigawatts of electrolyzers to produce 1 million tons per annum of hydrogen, they need to run at about 60 to 65% utilization. And that requires the 20 gigawatts of renewables to operate at an average capacity factor of about 30 to 35%. Now, renewables operating at 30 to 35% capacity factor is not an unreasonable expectation, but the problem is we've introduced what a colleague of mine refers to as the floor of averages. And there will be times when the renewables are generating at full output, but the electrolyzers can only absorb half of the energy being produced. So to make it all work, we need to invest in some significant storage. And then, if you look at the renewables, it's reasonable to assume you're going to have a blend of wind and solar to maximize the capacity factor of the combination of renewables and minimize the amount of very expensive storage that you need. So, we might assume that a unit cost is in the range of $1,500 per kilowatt average across wind and solar. So that then says that your 20 gigawatts of renewables cost $30 billion, which then leaves you nothing for storage, electrolyzers, or, balance of plant or anything else. So, yeah, I do think their costs are probably a bit too low, but, as a sort of a general rule, it's probably in the ballpark and gives, people who don't really know about it at all some kind of perspective on how much it's actually going to cost to do this. So yeah, 30, probably I would say somewhere more like 40 to 50 billion dollars to get you 1 million tons of hydrogen a year with current prices. But it's still a very big number.
Considering the gap between hydrogen and battery technology is widening, what, if anything, could close this gap in the future?
If anything, yeah, I'm not sure there is anything. It depends on the use case. So I think for land-based mobility, for battery electric vehicles of nearly any shape, there might be some very, very niche applications where hydrogen makes sense. But generally, I think for land-based mobility, hydrogen is like dead. It might have a role to play in like low cycle, long duration energy storage, where the very low round trip efficiency is less of an issue. If you've got a very low number of cycles, then it more comes down to the capital cost of the storage rather than the cycle efficiency in terms of how much it costs. So that might work, but there are other solutions to that. And with sort of cross-border grid integration and integration, of grids globally using HVDC interconnectors, which is starting to happen, we're going to end up with a sort of much broader geographical diversification of energy supplies and renewables, and we might find that we actually don't need that much long duration storage, so that might kill that case as well. So yeah, I mean, it's for the uninitiated, it's probably go and take a look at, like, again, this is Michael Liebreich's hydrogen ladder. That's pretty good in terms of where it might make sense and where it probably doesn't. And there's not a lot of use cases that make sense other than those that it's already used for, plus steel.
So what would you say to those who view hydrogen as an essential part of the solution to climate change, despite the challenges it faces?
Well, I mean, it is an essential part of the solution to climate change. So, we've previously said there's 100 million tons of it made every year at the moment using mainly natural gas, but also coal, which is like super high in emissions. And that generates about 2.5%, give or take, of global emissions today. So, we must address that. So it has an essential role to play in like the energy transition and decarbonization in terms of decarbonizing itself. We're going to continue to need ammonia for fertilizers. We're going to continue to need methanol and plastics. We're going to continue to need steel, decarbonized steel for construction, and hydrogen is currently probably the leading technology for that. And we need to do all that with like zero emissions hydrogen. So I think it has a massive role to play, and we shouldn't underestimate how difficult that's going to be. If we like now, let's go back to our World Bank numbers, the 1, 10, 20, 30, and we need, let's forget the bit that's associated with like fossil fuel processing, which is maybe 40, 45 million tons. So let's just take the remaining, I don't know, call it 50, 60 million tons, yeah? So 60 million tons at $30 billion per million tons per year is, I think that comes to 1.8 trillion by my maths. So that's the total investment required just to address existing uses of hydrogen. And how long that is going to take to spend, to build all that equipment, all of those, gigawatts of electrolyzers, 10 gigawatts of electrolyzers per million tons, 50, 60 million tons, that's, it's a lot of gigawatts of electrolyzers, and huge, vast amounts of renewables as well. So, I think it has a huge part to play. There needs to be a lot of money spent on it. and we shouldn't be messing around trying to find new ways to use it when we've already got a massive problem trying to decarbonize the existing uses.
Mark, thank you for this very interesting and realistic look at hydrogen.
You're very welcome.